Thanks for joining us here at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. I'm Ray Suarez, and I'm the host of our radio program On Shifting Ground, heard locally on KQED, but also streaming wherever you are on planet Earth. As a reminder, please silence your phones and submit any questions for our guests this evening via the question cards provided or the live chat if you're joining us online. Before we dive into the conversation, unfortunately, Jose Antonio Vargas will not be joining us this evening because he tested positive for COVID earlier this afternoon. His organization, Define American, helped us get this program in motion, so we appreciate their contributions, and I'm really sorry because I wanted to see Jose again from my old Washington days, but the show must go on. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Shireen Marisol Meraji, Assistant Professor of Race in Journalism and Head of Audio at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. Marisol Meraji is a veteran audio producer and journalist who has been telling stories with sound for more than 2 decades. She helped create NPR's groundbreaking and critically acclaimed podcast covering race and identity, Code Switch. Much of her work is focused on the experience of immigrant communities building their American identity. So she's an ideal conversation partner for a session about my new book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. So please welcome Shireen Marisol Meraji.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray.
So, we're right now talking about one old public servant, and we're not talking as much about immigration, but it remains hot as anything.
Well, a month before, we were only talking about that public servant. We're talking about President Joe Biden here. We were talking about his asylum ban. And so that was big news, and that sparked a conversation about immigration and whether this country's values and ideals around bringing people in through the asylum process are the same today as they were, let's say, 25, 30 years ago. When that was a topic a month ago, very big in the news, and we've forgotten about it already, I feel like. What were you saying about that?
You know, I worry about any time the country can act like it's settled business and the conversation's over, that we're going to make it harder to flee here. It was one of the most shameful episodes in the recent controversies about immigration when we decided we would not take immigrants from Syria. When President Assad was bombing civilian populations using fixed-wing aircraft, bombing neighborhoods into dust. People fleeing that were spreading out across the Mediterranean and into southern and southeastern Europe, but they were also making their way to other places in the world, and the United States said, we will not take them, which was disheartening, astounding. And the fact that it passed like that in a moment, it didn't become sort of a running sore, that was an indication that something was changing about the way we were thinking about people in trouble.
And this is policy you're talking about during the Trump administration.
Yes.
And during that election cycle, right before Trump was elected to the presidency, the conversation about refugee resettlement was a huge conversation right before the election. I remember going to Montana, to Missoula, Montana. They had decided to resettle refugees after a long period of not doing that in Missoula. And there was a huge amount of pushback from outside counties, Ravalli County, Flathead County, more conservative counties outside of Missoula, because we know Missoula is quite progressive, who said, we don't want refugees resettled here. We especially don't want Syrian refugees resettled here because they will there could be a terrorist element that comes in, and who knows? I mean, you can't prove that vetting will work 100% of the time. And if you can't prove 100% of the time that vetting won't work, then forget it. We don't want to bring anyone in who could possibly be a terrorist.
That conversational gambit, like who can know, to make these people impossible to know and to understand was just a trick to help make them dangerous or make them scary. We've used very, very thorough vetting for refugees for a long time. And no refugees, whether Somalis in Lewiston, Maine, or in the Twin Cities, Bosniaks who are rebuilding neighborhoods in St. Louis, the refugees that we've taken in have not lived down to our fears for them. But that has not been enough to end the conversation. And
Exactly.
I had a long talk with the head of HIAS, the Refugee Resettlement Agency, which was born over a century ago to help Jews of Eastern Europe find their way in the United States,
The H
fleeing.
used to stand for Hebrew in Hyatt.
Right.
Yeah.
Hebrew immigrant, I forget what, because they just go by HIAS now.
Yeah.
And the Tree of Life shooter in Pittsburgh targeted that synagogue because it was a supporter and sponsor of HIAS programs. They have said that they're overdoing it because they're so afraid that someone might slip through the cracks, that there are probably deserving people who are not getting into this country because they just can't take the chance. So it's worked. Making these people scary and unknowable has, in its way, worked.
But what I'm hearing you say is immigration hasn't bubbled up to the surface in this election cycle in the way that we've seen it maybe in the past 2 election cycles. And why do you think that is?
I think it's such an irregular time and 2 irregular candidates that we just haven't created the room for that part of the conversation. It's a big deal. What one of our major candidates is talking about doing is really turning back 100 years of tradition, practice, and ideas, and more recently, 50 years of an approach toward immigration, and doing it pretty much by fiat and hoping that it won't attract too much attention. But, you know, it's funny. In the book, I write about Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a town made famous by its reaction to immigrants and immigration. It was a fading small town in northeast Pennsylvania. 3 censuses in a row, it had a declining population, which is usually a bad sign. You had people of immigrant stock, the children and grandchildren of earlier European immigrants, who nobody in their families wanted their houses. It was that kind of situation. Dominicans were moving in from the New York City metropolitan area, and enterprising politicians used them as whipping boys and made Hazleton into a national cause célèbre in the anti-immigrant right. Dominicans have saved Hazleton. It has a growing population again. It doesn't have to close elementary schools anymore. It doesn't have an aging population. It has a revitalized commercial strip in the heart of downtown. But no matter how many times we learn this lesson, because we learn it over and over again, it never sticks. And that's always the interesting thing to me. I came of age as a reporter at a time when market rationality was supposed to be the straw that stirred America's drink, where if people see that things work this way, and this way, they change their behavior. Homo economicus. They just respond to what they see. But they don't respond to what they see. They respond to vibrations and changes in temperature in the room and all kinds of other things, and changes in tone in conversation. They don't learn these lessons, because we've taught this lesson to ourselves again and again and again since the mid-19th century, and it's never stuck. And that was part of my frustration, because I suspected as I began to wool gather for this book that what was adding to the nasty buzz of it all was that now, in the post-1965 era, for the first time, the majority of immigrants to the United States were no longer white. And that was sort of changing the way we thought about it, the inherent danger, the inherent risk, and all of that.
You know, you said you wrote this book in reaction to the Great Replacement theory, and you weren't able to get too much into that in the book. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about the Great Replacement theory and why that inspired you to write We Are Home.
I read the Great Replacement Manifesto, which floats around in some of the darker corners of the internet. And it seemed to me to be one of the most un-American, anti-American, ugly set of ideas that could be written by an American. And it also showed the kind of fragility and assault that certain quarters of the American population somehow feel that they are under. Where if they enter a game where they're not already guaranteed from the beginning that they're going to be the winners, that this is a new unfair rule. And the Great Replacement theory works on the premise that secretly, forces in society, Jews, are gaming immigration law, gaming legislative rules, and flooding the country purposely with non-white immigrants in order to replace the white population of the United States. Underlying this, or the foundation of it, is the belief that all good things that we have as a country have been made, developed, invented, thought of, advanced by white people. And that if these forces of civilization, these pillars of civilization, white Americans, are replaced as a percentage of the population, that's the beginning of the end of America.
Ray, I feel like this is absurd, absolute anti-Semitic, the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, you could call that.
So why not ignore it? why
Too many people believe it.
Okay.
Too many people believe it. Or too many people believe parts of it so that it gets under the skin of a society. Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's noxious. Yes, it's ugly. But if enough people believe it, you kind of have to pay attention to the fact that it's there. And the shooters in Poway, California, and in Pittsburgh, and in Buffalo, and in El Paso, men who went to kill lots of people in those places, when you look at their own personal writing and emails and internet traffic, it's fired up by the Great Replacement theory. So it's not a benign thing to have frustrated, disappointed people read this thing and say, I'm being cheated out of my birthright, which is to be in charge of this country, which is to be important, which is to know that if we make a line for some goodies that are being given out by society, I'm going to be at the front of the line. That widespread assumption and the widespread disappointment that's coming along with it has led to this being far more supercharged. I mean, you can read the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, a ridiculous anti-Semitic screed written in Tsarist Russia, published in English in the United States by Henry Ford and distributed around the country, and think, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not true, so let's just ignore it. It's still around there. If you go home tonight and go to your little Google thing and type in Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, you will get a copy of this crazy document from the early 20th century Russian Empire. It's still around. The internet is like an adrenaline shot to some of this stuff. Because instead of dying a natural death because of its crappiness, because of its shabbiness, it sticks around. It's like lint.
But how do you think this book is going to combat that? Like, are the people who might read The Great Replacement Theory or might feel enticed but are still on the line, would you want them to read this?
I would want them to read it. I doubt they will.
Yeah.
But I just want the other people who might read it and worry about these things and think about these challenges that our society has to know that this is something they ought to be keeping an eye on. It's not just some wacky thing that some crazy right-wing person that they saw on TV is talking about. It's a thing that millions of people are talking about.
Okay.
Do you worry? I mean, are you worried about this?
I am worried about
Okay.
this. I am worried about
So it's not just me.
No. No, but sometimes I wonder if things that are so absurd and ridiculous, like, are we adding more oxygen by talking about them? Should we ignore them? You know, these are things
Right.
that
Are
I
you
think
being
about.
a PR agent?
Exactly.
For the Great Replacement Theory?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's always a worry. Am I giving this thing more attention than it would get on its own? I came away from that deliberation sure that more people should know about this thing and know what's in it. They may have just heard the phrase, but never really thought too much about what was in it. They may have heard some YouTuber that they like talking about it, but never really read any of it. Don't be Great Replacement adjacent. Know what it is so you know so you know what's going on.
You know, another thing you said is that you wrote this book in reaction to the national discourse on immigration, which was ahistorical. You know, people really didn't know the historical context and they didn't understand immigration policy. And I will say that as a journalist who has written stories for NPR about immigration or about immigrants who have been affected by immigration policy, deeply affected, I think there definitely has been pushback from editors and gatekeepers who are not as interested in getting into the weeds, into the policy weeds. They're not as interested in getting into the historical weeds around immigration because it's complicated, one, and it's hard to make it interesting, and you have a very short amount of time. So it's like, let's center the human story and kind of ignore the policy bit or limit how much we talk about the policy bit. And personally, as a journalist, I think we're really doing our audience a disservice by leaving that out of the conversation. And then we get these national conversations around immigration that are ahistorical, that do go off the rails.
That's why I talk, for instance, about Bhagat Singh Thind. Not a major figure in American history, but such an interesting guy because he
Tried to become
humanizes, he crystallizes exactly what the difficulty was. I mean, I know you're all very familiar with the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, so I won't go into it in great detail. But basically, it expands the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s to take in a much larger piece of Asia and say that if you come to the United States from these places in the barred zone, you can't naturalize, you can't become a citizen, you can't vote. And Bhagat Singh Thind was a student in the United States. He was an advocate of Indian independence, and he joined the U.S. Army during the First World War. And one of the provisions of joining the Army was that if you were an immigrant, you could naturalize. So the Naturalization Board, at the end of the war, gave Bhagat Singh Thind his citizenship papers. And they were overruled by another branch of the federal government that said, well, no, this guy is an Indian. He's born a national of a country in the Asiatic Barred Zone. So he can't become an American citizen. We're taking away the citizenship that you gave him. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court bizarrely contradicts its own ruling of just a few years earlier that it made in a similar case involving a Japanese man, and said, well, yeah, I mean, technically, I guess Bhagat Singh Thind is white, but would the average person recognize him as white? He wears a turban, he's darker skinned.
Because he tried to make the case that he was Aryan.
He was Aryan, so thus, by definition,
He's white, yeah.
And they said, well, yeah, but would the average person call you white? I mean, that's what it got down to. And who wrote the ruling? An immigrant. But an immigrant from England who became a Supreme Court justice, showing what America was like in the 1920s. I thought, I got to tell people this story because they have to understand that this is far more complicated, far more capricious, far less linear than they ever thought.
When you were working full-time in broadcast journalism, do you think that you would have ever been able to tell that story?
Probably not. I mean, I'm grateful to the places that I worked, and they let me tell a lot of great stories over the years, but a lot of the stories that make it into this book are not things that they would have been interested in because they're not current or they're not easily legible as having a finger that they can put on today. Exactly. I would make the case that they are.
I would too.
But you know editors. I mean, sometimes you win that battle and sometimes you don't. But I think it's important for Americans to understand where we've been on all of this, how we got to where we were in 1965 when we totally changed the rules, and what's happened since then. When I talk to people about the Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, I get a blank stare. They have no idea what it is. It's one of the most significant pieces of legislation of the entire Johnson administration, an administration which had tons of significant legislation. It gave us the America, unintentionally, I believe, it gave us the America that we have now and the one that's coming in the 2040s. And its legislative champion in the U.S. Senate, Teddy Kennedy, and its champion in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, one of the ways they got recalcitrant Southern senators to vote for it was by telling them that it wasn't really going to change the country. They were wrong. It's changing the country.
And talk about what that act did that changed the immigration system.
From 1924 to 1965, we had a set of laws in place that created formulas and quotas that favored Europe. So if you wanted to come to this country from Europe, you were in pretty good shape. If you wanted to come from anywhere else, it was significantly harder. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act pretty much throws open the door to the rest of the world. And there were small numbers of Indians, Pakistanis, Southeast Asians, very small. They were here, but in very small numbers. Now we're talking about numbers in the millions, and Asian immigrants to the United States are the fastest growing category of people moving here from elsewhere on the planet. Black Americans may be surprised to find out that 1 out of every 10 black people in the United States is an immigrant, which is a massive change from our history when black people were the most uniformly native born of all Americans, except for Native Americans, obviously. But of all the other people who have come here since the encounter in 1492, the most native born population, certainly by the time of the United States, was black people. Well, now 1 out of 5 black people living in the United States is either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. That is a remarkable change in a fairly short amount of time. I wrote a whole chapter about it. It isn't getting the kind of play that I thought it would. I thought that there'd be a certain amount of gee whiz factor there, but it hasn't worked out that way yet.
Just wait. It'll happen. On Code Switch, we talked a lot about the tension between Black immigrants and African Americans who could trace their lineage to enslavement, and you know how that's changing Black identity in the United States. And it's definitely a very rich and fruitful conversation to have.
And, you know, a big deal in certain places and maybe less so in others. New York has a sizable West African and East African population now, and is also the place where more Black Americans live than any other city. So it's a big deal there. It's certainly a big deal in Washington, which became a real refugee hub toward the end of the Cold War, when people from the Horn of Africa really started to move to Washington, D.C. in large numbers. Chicago is a big center, as are the big Texan megacities, particularly Houston and Dallas. Big Liberian and Nigerian populations there. And certainly in New York, large numbers of Caribbeans, which, you know, you go to a place like East Flatbush in Brooklyn, it's remarkable. Whites ran out of that neighborhood in the 1960s. It moved in a fairly short number of years from being 90% white to 90% Black, which, if you've ever lived through it or watched it happen in a neighborhood, is not a happy process. But now, the level of education is higher, the income level is higher, and the real estate is worth a hell of a lot more than it was then, even corrected for $1965. Though people quickly loading up the moving vans and heading out to Long Island and northern New Jersey wouldn't have believed it, the neighborhood was actually upclassing by having all its white people move out. So I got a laugh out there from somewhere. But, you know, that was not the mental map that people used about white flight. But East Flatbush was one of those neighborhoods where, you know, it was foremen from the Postal Service and school teachers and middle management in New York City government and that kind of thing. And they were buying the houses and changing Brooklyn. And Brooklyn's a very interesting place right now.
Why do you think that statistic, that 1 in 10 Black Americans is an immigrant, isn't hitting in the way that you thought it would, isn't getting picked up in the way that you thought it would?
I think our conversation about race in general is so involved in other things right now that a conversation about the nature of Black America changing just isn't on anybody's menu. I don't entirely understand it. You know, it was a big deal during the Cold War. Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower were really very intensely aware of the fact that the national news agencies of communist countries were showing newsreel footage in the global South of students being hit with fire hoses and having dogs set on them, of police cracking heads in the streets of southern cities, of buses being set on fire. That we forget the Cold War context for the national nervous breakdown around civil rights. They were very much thinking about it and talking about it in Washington, if less so in Birmingham and Montgomery. And to have maybe 1 or 2 generations removed from people sitting in Accra and Dakar and Addis Ababa and watching film of people being fire hosed and buses being firebombed and the 16th Street Baptist Church and all of that, and then want to move to the United States, is, I think, a kind of redemptive moment. It opens some possibilities for the conversation that weren't there before. Every African that I spoke to said, look, I knew about all of that. And that was, one of those moments you think, oh. They said, yeah. People said, I knew about all of that. I knew it would not always be easy. But America offered so much opportunity that I really wanted to try it out. One guy, Jabril from Senegal, said, I always wanted to move to America. Mm-hmm. America to them was also Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan, not just Martin King. And the potency and reach of American culture. The most famous black people on the planet are often, I wouldn't say always, but often Americans, even with our complicated and sometimes heartbreaking history. So I thought it was really kind of interesting that in Jamaica and Barbados and Nigeria, people were saying, I want to try to go to America. One of the first chapters in the book is an oral history from a guy who grew up in Mombasa, Kenya, not Barack Obama's hometown, but supposedly Barack Obama's hometown. And Samir moves to the United States having just completed high school and is ready for a life of adventure because he's marinated his whole life in American pop culture. Mm-hmm. He knows all the movies. When he talks to me about going to a military recruiting office, he brings up A Few Good Men as like one of the things that he thought about. I wanted to be like Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men. I thought, really? But yes. And his American education begins in Columbia, Maryland, which is a planned suburb outside Washington, D.C., which he found impossibly boring. And before too long, he was working 80 hours a week, 2 full-time jobs, one at the morning breakfast service at a McDonald's drive-through window, and then another 40 hours a week at a Wawa, which is a northeastern convenience store that I recommend to you. And he says, I couldn't believe that this was what my life had become. Trying to learn cheeses at the counter of a Wawa. And why did people want so many different cheeses on their sandwich? Anyway, how many cheeses do these people have? He joins the military, mm-hmm. gets sent to Korea, and they pair American units with Korean units. The irony being, of course, in his case, a lot of these young Korean soldiers had relatives in the United States because so many Koreans have moved to the United States. And he, who had lived in America for all of 3 months before signing up, knew nothing about the United States. So they all wanted to talk to him about life in America, and he would say, I really don't know anything about America. And they'd look at him standing there in a U.S. Army uniform and think, well, what do you mean you don't know anything about America? He got his American education by being a soldier, and then by responding to the anti-Muslim sentiments after 9/11, and then the Muslim ban of the early months of the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. He stepped fully into his Americanness by making signs and grabbing his kids and going to protests. He was
protesting the Muslim ban.
Protesting the Muslim ban. He was proud of himself, proud that he was an American veteran and a citizen and speaking up against this law, and sort of fully, it was almost like there was an effervescing moment where finally the screen cleared and he felt really American even when fighting against what he saw as an un-American law. It's kind of a great moment.
That's the opposite of my father, who came as a Muslim from Iran in 1969. He was a student. And he doesn't talk very much about why he came and his feelings around what happened to him when he was here. But when the Muslim ban happened, my father said to me, this is not the country that I came to, that I wanted to come to. This is not the country that I thought it was, and I wish I had never come here. That is,
Wow.
and for me, that is like, I was so shocked. I was like,
Even
I was
given
shocked.
where Iran was at the time, he
even
was,
given that.
wow.
In that moment, and he's just so upset, just so, I think it was just this passionate reaction. It wasn't like, I'm going to go out and protest because I'm an American. It was like him rethinking his decision to even come to this country. And I have to say, my grandfather, who is Puerto Rican and fought in the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War, after Hurricane Maria and the paper towel incident, President Trump throwing paper towels at Puerto Ricans, he was so upset that he fought for this country. And this is the disrespect that Puerto Ricans had to encounter from, the president of the United States at the time. He was very upset. Both of them were rethinking why they came here. They were so hurt. I mean, really during the Trump administration, and having second thoughts about ever making this decision.
The story of Islam in America over the last 40 years has been not exactly a happy story, but a fascinating one always. There are Muslim populations across the country in places like Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and Norman, Oklahoma, and Jackson, Mississippi, wherever there are state colleges with engineering programs, because all these countries were sending over young men to get degrees in electrical engineering and petroleum engineering. Texas cities have big Muslim populations.
They used to call my dad Mohandas because it was a joke, which is like engineer in Farsi, because he was the only one of his friends who didn't go to school for engineering. Anyway, but yes.
But the oldest mosque in America is in Iowa. I mean, you might guess that it's somewhere else. It's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And I write in the book about the experience of the imam in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, because that was his American education. The backlash after 9/11 against a congregation that had been there in Murfreesboro for decades. Middle Tennessee State University is there in Murfreesboro, so you get these young men, mostly, and eventually wives and children. The place was outgrowing its storefront and wanted to build a purpose-built mosque on the outskirts of town. Several of the members had done quite well. They donated the land and said, here, build the mosque. And they get ready to build it, ready to rock and roll. The city turns down their request for a permit, coming up with cockamamie excuses, but basically, a lot of the people of Murfreesboro had jumped into action to block this mosque being built.
Wasn't there a huge mosque controversy too in New York City
Yes.
because it was near the ground zero? Yeah. So
And
it was happening in New York too.
it was happening in New York too. And again, donated, and they were just going to make an Islamic center there, which included a place of worship. And somebody got the idea that it was a victory mosque. So on the right, it started to be referred to as the Victory Mosque. Mm-hmm. And they made up a story. They said, wherever, and I'd had people tell me this story, so I know the story was made up. Wherever they win a battle, they build a mosque. And I say, really? Is that true? Can you name any mosques where they've won battles and built a mosque? No. But this was the story, and it was, again, amplified, given that injection of adrenaline, and shot into the veins of a waiting American public. Poor old Osama Balul, the imam in Murfreesboro, went to public information sessions. Mm-hmm. He tried to talk to members of the community who were opposed to the mosque being there. And in the process, again, learned about being an American. He was quoting the Constitution to me, quoting the Declaration of Independence. He married an American. He says, my kids are American. This is my country. And he also was very funny. So when he went to one of these public information sessions, a line came up to the stage at the end, and people are coming by and thanking him for coming. And one woman approaches him, and he thinks she's about to shake his hand, so he puts out his hand, and she puts a bunch of pork sausages into his hand and says to him, "You're so full of hate that you even hate these pigs."
And his response is priceless.
His response was, "Madam, if anybody hates these pigs, it is you. If there are any pigs alive, it is because people like me will not eat them." He was great fun. You could tell that his feelings had really been hurt. This was a hard thing for him to go through this. Here he was thinking that he was sort of a community guy. Mm-hmm. He had been working as an imam, and the congregation was growing, and he went to Chamber of Commerce things, and he sort of had a little profile. But now he was basically treated like a terrorist. And you could tell it hurt his feelings, and then I talked to him again more than a decade later, and
he's in Nashville now.
He's in Nashville. He moved on to a bigger place. But also he was philosophical about his experience, and isn't full of regret. He's kind of glad that he went through all of this in a strange way. He said he learned so much. And I thought, well, I'm glad you're not bitter. I'm glad you feel that way. But kind of a cool guy.
Yeah, I think my father is nearing the end of his life, and I think he is rethinking a lot of things, and there is some regret that's coming up, and we're having deeper conversations. And one of them is that, he wanted his children to be accepted and to assimilate, and he has a very thick accent, and Farsi is his first language, and he didn't teach us our heritage language, and my mom didn't do the same in Spanish. And I've been picking up a little bit of Persian here and there, and I'll talk to him over the phone, and he lights up now. And I think one of his big regrets is not sharing his culture with us, and sharing his culture with us really for him meant sharing his language.
But isn't part of that the refugee's dilemma? That some places that you come from are places that you can't go back to. So your way of bringing it to your children is totally different from if you could just pick them up, get them passports and go visit.
Yeah.
And say, this is where I went to school, and this is where I used to play ball and all this. You can't do that. A lot of Cubans have that same.
But Cubans are so great about I would say Iranians are quite good about keeping language too, but my father wasn't. He didn't want that for us. He wanted us to be American. He wanted us to assimilate into the American way. And I think what he didn't recognize was that we never felt like we belonged. We never felt quite like we were these Americans that he really wanted us to be. I mean, they still name me Shireen Marisol Meraji, and people are still like, what are you? And then you say, well, I'm Iranian and I'm Puerto Rican. And then they're like, oh, you speak Persian? Do you speak Spanish? And then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm disconnected not only from my heritage, I'm also not really thought of as an American. And I think there's a lot of people.
Talk about being caught between two stools.
And there's so many people that are just like me. I mean, I think multiracial Americans are the fastest growing Americans in the United States. I think that's something that you mentioned in the book. 25 million adults in the United States are children of immigrants. So they're going through some type of, I don't know if the feeling is shame because they're not as connected to their culture as they want to be, or guilt that they didn't do exactly what their parents wanted them to do when their parents sacrificed so much. I mean, I think there's like very rich conversations to be had around what it means to be a child of an immigrant in this country. and then what it means on top of that, what it means to be a multi-racial child of immigrants in this country. I mean, I think that's where the conversation is going next.
But I think if there's any good news in that, and you can start taking a look at those because we got.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
If there's any redemptive quality in that, I would say it's this. In 2010 was the first year that in American maternity wards, a slight majority of people were born who don't trace their ancestry to Europe, but trace it instead to Africa, Asia, or Latin America. It's been true every year since then, so those kids are starting high school in September. They'll be starting college 4 years from now. They're growing up in an America where everybody's something. And, there's a tail that hangs from there, or maybe there's no tail, depending on how your own family wants to handle that. But my kids, when I look at the way they grew up, and certainly their school world, it's much different from the tension and anger and emotion that was around going to public school in the mid-'60s, when in New York City it was not a great time to be going to school. And they've had black teachers, black principals, black and all kinds of other immigrant classmates all during their schooling. Unremarkably, just part of the deal. And when I tell them about what busing was like and what was happening in places like New York and Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia, it's like stories from another country for them. So I think we might be on our way to something different and something or even arguably better when it comes to the way we think about these things. I hope so. I feel hopeful.
All right, I'm going to ask a question from the audience. Ray, can you talk about why you embraced personal stories in your book? How was it a different experience for you?
This is my fourth book, and the previous three books were pretty conventionally told books by a journalist. Dive into archives, news morgues, city records, census data, all just conventional digging, narrative, and interviews too. But for this book, the longer I worked on it, the more I became convinced that instead of just being part of the story I tell, these personal stories have to become the core of the book. Partially because they told their lives better than I could talking about them. It gave them the privilege of self-definition instead of retaining for me the privilege of definition, which a journalist always has or often has. But here they spoke for themselves and told their stories in ways that were surprising, shocking, amusing, all kinds of things, but they did it for themselves. And I'm glad my editor and I fought over this a long time, and we ended up with that. He was right, I was wrong.
Wait, so talk about the battle. What did you want to do with the book, and what was your editor? Your editor was pushing it to be more personal.
My first couple of chapters were pretty angry. It was an angry book.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, don't write this angry book. I think there's another story here to tell. Tell that other stuff. Yeah, and it's in there. But it's not just that."
Got it.
So,
and he was right, you're saying.
He was right. I think he was right, yeah. So Bruce Nichols, if you're watching, you were right. If Trump is reelected, just how dark will the next chapter of American immigration get? Well, depends on if he really means what he says. But I think there are a lot of people who, in principle, when they hear of mass deportation, they think, well, those people are breaking the law, they shouldn't be here, blah, blah, blah. But when they turn on the TV and see vans with people being dragged into them by uniformed agents of the state with their kids standing out on the sidewalk and screaming and crying, then it won't be abstract anymore. It won't be an abstract principle. What mass deportation would look like in a country that really means to do it is something that Americans could never countenance. I really believe that. So he says he's going to do it. I don't know if he's really going to do it, but if he tried to do it, I think it would horrify even many of the people who think that today, in principle, they're for it. Because what it would do, leaving empty houses on streets in cities all over the country, stores that don't open up tomorrow morning because their owner is in detention somewhere, shifts that aren't full because workers are gone now. We're not ready for that, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we are.
In between Biden's poor debate performance, Trump was stoking the fears of illegal immigration. Will the issue decide the election for undecided voters?
There's like 120 days left. I think there are still several chapters to be played out in the current novella, the current soap opera, so I'm not really clear. You know, earlier this year, voters told pollsters that immigration was near the top of the list of issues that they would be thinking about. I don't know if we did that same polling in 2 weeks from now, whether that would still be the case. I think, it's still in the top 10. I don't think it's going to be definitive in that way. Or, God, even a lot can happen in 4 months. We'll see. But how should politicians balance fair and equitable immigration policy with public sentiment that is not wholly supportive?
With public sentiment that is not
Smart person out there writing a smart
supportive
question.
of fair policy.
Right. Well, I will give you a little green room dish. Before we came out here, I said to Shireen that I'm tired of waiting for people to do the right thing for the right reason. I don't care if they do the right thing for the right reason. Even if they do the right thing for the wrong reason, that's okay, as long as they do the right thing. And there are economic arguments, strictly economic arguments to be made about immigration that have nothing to do with American values, being our best selves, being a welcoming country, none of that stuff.
That's right.
American women are not having many babies. We're not at replacement level population. I'm going to start taking a Social Security check in a couple of years. Maybe you know somebody who's doing the same. And the FICA taxes have to be paid by somebody. Mm-hmm. And, there's real practical arguments about who's going to pick the cabbages and bust the tables and fight in the wars and do all the other things that we do as a society.
And take care of our aging population.
Huge. America is 14% foreign born, and the home healthcare workforce of this country is over 50% foreign born, which means that many people are going to spend the elderly, infirm years of their life in the constant company of someone that they wouldn't have even lived next door to.
Yep.
That person is going to bathe them, feed them, make sure they take their medicines properly, and cry at their funeral. And we haven't really taken the measure of what a gray tsunami is really going to look like in a light benefits state, which compared to other developed countries, we are a light benefits state. And, they are among the most poorly paid workers in American society. And we really haven't even begun to reckon with what that's going to look like as a country. Who's going to take care of, my father's 86. He lives in assisted living. Much of the staff of the place where he lives is foreign born. Mm-hmm. My mother-in-law, who just died the year before last, had a Filipino nurse as her companion into her final days. And my best friend's mother died at 90 just recently, and who was at her funeral? Her staff, who loved her and were weeping copiously at her funeral. And I thought, oh my God, we aren't talking about this or thinking about it at all.
You know, I graduated from San Francisco State. I was a Raza Studies major at the time, and I was in a class where that was a big topic of discussion 25 years ago.
Wow.
That the population is going to age, and who is going to take care of these people. And the conversation in the Raza Studies class was that it would be immigrants from Latin America who would do that work.
It was a true answer, but not a fully defined
That's
answer,
right.
because
Not a
it's
fully
immigrants
defined answer.
also from West Africa and the
Exactly.
Caribbean
Right.
and Asia now, increasingly.
But that seed was planted in my head, 25 years ago in an ethnic studies class at San Francisco State, and I'll never forget it. Another thing we've been talking about American, and another thing that, going to San Francisco State and being in the College of Ethnic Studies and it's now Latina studies. It's probably going to be Latine studies at some point. But one thing that I learned was, Nuestra America, Jose Marti, Cuban revolutionary. What is America? It's not the United States of America. America is Canada. America is Central America. America is South America and the Caribbean. And we're all intrinsically linked. So what does it mean to be an American is so... I don't know, the word American, the identifier American, I wish we could go back and change it to a United Statesian or something like that, because I feel like it does separate people who should have that identifier, who deserve that identifier too.
Do you find attitudes toward becoming American consistent among immigrants and their American-born children? Any thoughts as to the American-born children of immigrants? That's a great question, too. Everybody thought hard about this before they came today.
Well, I'm a child of immigrants, a migrant and an immigrant, because Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and so it's a weird, it's an immigrant story, it's a migrant story. And I would say that I personally, and I've talked to a lot of children of immigrants who feel uncomfortable with the American identifier, because they don't feel, especially ones who have been racialized here in the United States and othered here in the United States, they feel like they don't necessarily want to claim that identifier because they have not felt welcomed here.
I write in one of my chapters about a Californian, raised in Ohio but moved here, named Apurva Desai, cool guy, and he grew up, he says, inside the family. They call it ABCDs, American-born confused Desis, who, when they walk over the threshold of their home, they're in India for all intents and purposes. Indian music, Indian food, Indian conversation, Indian social norms. Mm-hmm. Then when they go out into the world, they're this American-born, citizen-born person who also has to navigate, in his case, the bizarre American way of race, where in his case, being a South Asian, he wasn't white and he wasn't black, but there wasn't really an established Asian identity either in his Ohio town. And he and some other people I spoke to who are the children of that first wave, large wave of post-1965 Asian immigrants, have a very unusual and ambivalent attitude toward the United States. They learn America right along with their parents, even though they were born here. Mm-hmm. And how they learn it, how they learn about racial attitudes from the people that they grow up around, how they learn about attitudes toward ethnicities and immigrants. They know themselves. They inhabit their bodies. They are who they are. It's only by bouncing off other people that they understand how they're regarded in those places. Cool stories. You should really read the book.
Can I just, there's something in this book that really made me feel something, and I want to read it. And this is about this feeling of being welcome here or not being welcome here. And there's a woman in the book named Dalia Mogahed, and she came to the United States from Egypt. She wears hijab, and you asked her if she felt less welcome in the United States of America post 9/11. And her response to you was really interesting. She says to you, Ray, you use the word welcome, and I like that you used it because it gives me a chance to say, I'm not waiting for a welcome. This is my home. If anyone has a problem with me being in my home, they are free to leave. But I'm not waiting for anyone's welcome because I'm not a guest here. And then she goes on to say, I push back on Muslims who talk about not feeling welcomed because it will create a paradigm in your mind where you are forever the guest to a host, and it's in an unhealthy way to think.
Yes, and Dalia is tough and smart and needle sharp. And I was shifting in my seat a little bit. I mean, I thought it was a perfectly reasonable question because I
did too. I talk about belonging all the time.
And I felt the desire to be welcomed from these people who told me their stories.
Yeah.
They wanted to just be regarded as neighbors and workmates and friends and all that. And Dalia, that was a very smart idea because she sees inherent in that word. I mean, she speaks English as a second language, and with great precision and care, she sees a power dynamic set up by the use of that word, welcome, where someone else can put themselves in a position of being able to give you permission to be somewhere where you already belong.
I loved it.
That was a very good point. I still think immigrants want to feel welcome.
It's true.
But she's right that we don't have anybody who's a gatekeeper for you. There's a phrase that's being used now, heritage Americans or legacy Americans. That's the phrase Tucker Carlson uses. Legacy Americans, where those people...
Are we talking about Native Americans?
No, funnily enough, we're not. He means people who have been here long enough that they're really supposed to run the show. And the very strong sense that they are gatekeepers, that they get to say who belongs and who doesn't, that they get to say who is American enough and who's not, helps fuel that great replacement rhetoric, helps fuel that idea that someone else can decide for you whether you've done enough to be considered by them to be an American. The brass on those people is unbelievable, but they're actually being encouraged by people like Tucker Carlson. A legacy American? Wong Kim Ark, who fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court in the 1890s and established birthright citizenship, took care of that. He slayed that dragon. Once and for all, there is no such thing as a legacy American. If you're an American, you're American, and no one else can say you're not, or you're not like them, or you're not as American as they are. And thank God for that.
I dropped my question. How are we on time? Are we doing good?
We're almost done, but these people seem to be having a good time. Can you handle another couple of questions? Okay. Shireen, can you speak to why personal stories matter to conversations on race, immigration, and identity politics? What did you learn from Code Switch storytelling?
I learned that personal stories make policy real. So but I always think, and we did this with Code Switch, is that we combined history and we combined policy with personal story. And we had time to do that because we were a podcast, and so we didn't have to do it in 3.5 minutes on Morning Edition, where it's very hard to do all of those things at once. We had a half an hour every single week, and we could go back to a topic over and over again. But I think what is wonderful about personal stories is that it makes things that are really complicated and maybe boring for people to want to digest and listen to real. It makes it real. It makes it human. It makes these policies understandable when you see them through the eyes of a human being. And I think that's why personal story is so incredibly important. And it helps us understand one another as human beings.
Do you find that people are reliable, factual narrators of their own experience?
You know, we do a lot of fact checking when we are, as much as we can, when we're asking people about their personal experience. It's been my experience doing this work that they are. What about you? I mean, you talk to a lot of people about their personal story.
I generally find them, because when they're telling you things that are not so praiseworthy, things that they're not so proud of today, it's a reminder that you've entered into a zone of trust with them. They are giving you something very precious to hold, their story. And they trust you in that moment, which is why they're telling you all of this. Why somebody you've never met before is going to sit with you for an hour and tell you about their personal lives. And that zone of trust works in both directions, I think. They had to be assured that I wasn't going to take advantage of them in some way. And I had to assure them that what they were doing was an important and a good thing that was useful for their greater interest, which is to be understood and to have people like them be understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that people have been reliable. And I think that the personal stories with Code Switch, I'll just talk about a story that I can't stop thinking about. And I profiled 3 members of a family, the Gonzalez family, who all had different immigration status. So the youngest son, Jose Ventura, is an American citizen. He was born in the United States. One of the middle daughters, Abigail, she was completely undocumented. She hadn't filed for DACA before Jeff Sessions, during the Trump administration in 2017, said, we're not going to take any more new DACA, or we're not going to give DACA to new people, and we're going to get rid of DACA. And then Miriam Gonzalez, who was documented, she had DACA. And I talked to each of them separately about their experiences. And all of them said at the end of those interviews, we have never talked to each other about this. We have never talked to each other about, in the case of Jose Ventura, who is a citizen, all the pressure that he felt that when he turned 21, he had to fix his family's papers, and that he had to make sure that he had a job that could support all of his family so that he could sponsor them so that they could be here legally and then get legal permanent residence. And he told me, every day I live with the pressure of trying to live up to a person who can do that for my family. And then Abigail, who had no documentation, was like, oh my God, I've lived in this country my entire life since I was 6 months, a baby. And I don't even really speak Spanish that well. And everyone's telling me that I don't belong here, this one place that I've ever known, and I could be deported at any moment because I don't have DACA. And then Miriam, who had DACA, who was older, talking to me about how much guilt she feels that she didn't force her 15-year-old sister to get DACA when she could have gotten DACA. And that they listened to the lawyer who was like, oh, maybe it's too dangerous right now to give the government her information, so maybe wait. And then Trump was elected, and then everything happened. And, you know, I think telling those stories from their different perspectives, one, tons of people who were listening were like, that is my experience in my life. And I have never heard my experience reflected in the national media. And it was really just so, I don't know, what is the word? It's just to be seen for the first time in the public, you know? So I think it did that. And also they were able to say things that they had never said to each other to me. And that opened up a conversation amongst the three of them that they're hopefully continuing to have.
My editor, after he read the story of Andrew Lee, who's a local Bay Area businessman, said to me, well, you have to talk to somebody who came here more recently. How about an Afghan? Right then, a lot of Afghan refugees were coming into the United States. And I had an amazing experience, because I kept talking to Afghan refugees about talking to me. And to my face, they would agree and then ghost.
Yeah.
Because, and this is totally understandable, they were worried about their relatives who were still in Afghanistan. They were worried about their own status, which was still very unsettled. And I would tell them, oh, look, nothing I write in a book that's not even going to come out for another year and a half is going to have anything to do with you. But they're coming at this from a mentality of, I can't make any mistakes, I can't call any attention to myself, and I can't say anything that might put the U.S. government and its processes and procedures in a bad light. So better I just not talk to this guy at all. And it went on for months. People kept saying, oh, yes, I'll talk to you, and then disappearing. Finally, a guy agreed to talk to me, and I promised to change his name, which I do transparently in the book. I said, well, look, you get to be like Adam. You get to pick a name. And we worked out a name, so that's his name in the book. And he was an officer in the Afghan Air Force. And he's been struggling to get his family out of Afghanistan since the fall of Kabul. Just a beautiful, decent guy. You felt for him. I couldn't really do anything for him. I'm just glad that he was willing to trust me on the say-so. His immigration lawyer vouched for me. On the say-so from his lawyer, who gave him the nod and said it was okay. His story is so high impact that I hope he feels good about it now, but it was a very important thing for him to overcome his own misgivings and talk to me about his experiences.
And 70,000 Afghans are here who left during the withdrawal in August of 2021, was it? Are here on something called humanitarian parole.
Which is temporary.
Which is temporary. It's a 2-year thing. And the United States, the history of humanitarian parole has been that usually when you give a large group humanitarian parole, then there's something that the Congress passes to make it so that they can get legal permanent residence. It's an adjustment act is what they're called. And for whatever reason, the United States cannot seem to work out an Afghan Adjustment Act so that all of these Afghans who are here on humanitarian parole can, not be in limbo, so that they can actually find a way to legal permanent residence. And so that's a huge issue right now. That's a policy that's very complicated that nobody wants to talk about, but I encourage all of you to look into it.
Right, well, there's an example of something that's in the weeds, but it's not really. It's something very basic that affects the lives of tens of thousands of people who really are afraid, genuinely afraid of going back to Afghanistan, and often for very good reason.
Yeah, can you imagine being here and then 2 years? 2 years goes by fast. And then what? You have to go back to Kabul? Humanitarian parole.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. And please thank Shireen Marisol Meraji.
Oh, and thank Ray.
You can get your hands on a copy of my new book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, at your local bookstore now. We will also be shipping out copies to people who wish to make a purchase here tonight, and I will be signing book plates in the lounge in just a moment. If you'd like to engage in future programs or support Commonwealth Club World Affairs, please visit the website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you with us tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.